So good afternoon or good evening, everybody, depending on where you are. So I'm Bibi Sun, a sessional lecturer at JCU Singapore. And it's my pleasure to introduce Lahiru, who is the speaker for today's TESS seminar. Lahiru runs the forest program across 12 Asian countries for BirdLife International. This includes his role on the board of management of Hutan, Harapan, and ecosystem restoration concession in Sumatra that accounts for 30% of the remaining lowland forests of Sumatra, which includes tigers, elephants, and forest-based indigenous communities. He's also a tropical peatland scientist who has worked on policy, carbon emissions, and restoration of peatlands and mangroves across all regions of Southeast Asia. So he's going to give us a talk today on discovering undescribed species and take us to 19 years of exploration and conservation work in Southeast Asia. Okay, so over to you, Lahiru.
Thank you, Bibi, for having me, and it's good to have everyone here, particularly the people in Canada who are awake for this. This presentation that I'm going to give is probably the hardest presentation that I've ever had to do, because it's pretty much talking about a career that I would have done if I had not become a hands-on conservation biologist. So now I'm still a botanist, but I do botany when I can, but also acknowledging that botany alone and doing taxonomy alone doesn't save species meant that I had to reinvent myself and go in a different direction. So it was really challenging to make this presentation, but also kind of rewarding, because it just shows me that, I mean, I still do taxonomy, but in a different way, and it still has some kind of utility going forward. So where's this? Is the slides moving? Yeah, this talk actually came up when Bibi invited me, because we described a new species sometime last year from a Peatswamp, and I just happened to write on LinkedIn about the tree that we had described. I was doing my PhD in Sumatra at the time, and we found 7 species that didn't match anything else. We knew they were new, but there was no flowering and fruiting material, so we couldn't describe them. So that was in 2017. It took another 5 to 8 years for us to actually describe these species, because we had to wait for them to flower. And all we know about them is just this, what I write here, the fact that we describe this species as new, we know the species exists, and that's it. We don't know anything about it. And majority of the tropical trees and other plants in Southeast Asia and the world, this is all we know about them. But I think when it comes to extinction, it's not actually on the radar nowadays, even though most of us botanists and biologists, we talk about it. It's not at the forefront now when it comes to climate change stuff. So this is actually the basis of why I'm actually talking to you. And because once I wrote this, it got picked up by media, people wrote about it, there was newspaper articles, there was interviews, everything coming up, because suddenly there's this humongous tree that no one knew existed, and literally we don't know anything about it. And you look at these flowers and fruits, the fruits are bright red and amazingly large. And the idea is that, yeah, when it comes to most of these ecosystems, we really know nothing about them. And that's why this all started. So I'm going to take you on a journey of when I've described them on, I think, 14 species over the process, but there were different points in my career, and my thinking was different at the time. I never thought that I'd still be describing species now. It's still not my main job, but it is also one of the most interesting ones. And if describing species actually led to their conservation, I would actually be describing species full-time or just taxonomy full-time, but it doesn't always lead to conservation outcomes. So when I started my career, the first thing I started working on was limestone hills in Peninsular Malaysia. And this is with one of Bill's PhD students, Ruben Clements, who was doing his PhD his master's with Navjot Sodhi at the time. And he actually wrote this paper about limestone casts. And in 2004 onwards, we started exploring every single part of Peninsular Malaysia, every single limestone hill. I think there's almost about 200 or 300 of them. And Peninsular Malaysia at that time was covered in forest. It was a very, very different time. And I grew up in the Middle East and South Asia, and coming to Southeast Asia and seeing biodiversity was the main thing. And the idea was to go out and see biodiversity, experience it, and then lead to its conservation. And Limestone Hills was a perfect place because you get all these really endemic plants, snails, bats, everything you can imagine, and surrounded by forests, and no one was working in them, and a really high level of endemism. But the same time that we were actually out in the field from 2002, most of Peninsula was still forested. And this is a map for 2006. It's actually showing, I mean, of course, if you look at it further down the line, it's much more. But what you can see is even at that time, deforestation and the land use change that was coming had already started. And we were actually in the field to see this happening. And it kind of changed the way we thought about stuff, because this is actually up here in the square in the upper part there. There's a deforestation event there between 2002 and 6. And we were actually active in limestone hills in that area. Ruben eventually did his PhD to the right of that site. And this is actually 2002, what it actually looked like. And actually, you can see that huge road down the middle is actually the road between the state of Kelantan and Terengganu. And all this huge forest, primary forest or locked over forest, was being cleared. And as a young biologist, it was exactly like, it was like which is your worst nightmare, right? You don't expect to, you go out to expect to see biodiversity and study it, as opposed to going out and seeing all the destruction happen. And this is, of course, from Indonesia, a photograph, but we didn't take photographs at the time we were in Peninsula, because we didn't actually realize the kind of wave of deforestation that we were in at the time. We actually thought that, okay, if we do the science properly, we do proper advocacy, we could actually be able to stop this. But we were actually on the ground seeing all this huge forest being converted to oil palm and rubber. And at the same time, what we could see was actually limestone hills being quarried for cement, and huge proportions of them. And species, like most of these hills also had species that are only found on the hill, and they would go extinct if you deforest the landscape. And at that time, extinction was still on the radar. We were still talking about extinction globally, and that was the biggest threat. We were talking about climate change, but not, I mean, I would say extinction was equally as important as climate change at the time. Now it's completely the opposite. We don't even hear extinction. So the belief at the time that I had when I was doing all this stuff was, okay, the lack of knowledge was what was leading to extinction. Science data and publications, that if you do the science properly and you communicate it properly to the policymakers, you would actually be able to get the conservation done. And the idea was that, okay, maybe we can stop some of this deforestation or even reverse it at the time. And I mean, it was, at the time, I think we were naive to think that, but at that time, we had not seen this kind of large scale landscape level changes that we've seen since. And so what I did was, I did what a young scientist would do, which is focus on the science, get the data out there and the information out there, and correspond it, give it to policymakers, talk to people, and that would lead to the change. That's what I believed at the time. So what I did was, I didn't work on limestones. I actually worked with Peter on peatswamps. And so peatswamps are, you get them in lowland Southeast Asia and some highlands. They cover about 21% of the land area. They are actually about 85% organic soils. So your land, about 21% of your land exists because peat soils exist. Most of them are coastal. And they are very unique ecosystems. And because of the unique high acidity, high carbon levels, you have unique biodiversity in it. So I did what Ruben did. He did what he did for limestone, I did for peat. Write a review paper, get all the data together, find out where all the biodiversity is, and write the papers to show everyone where everything is. And what we found was, of course, that the high levels of endemism in peat swamps, that there's about 250 to 350 species of fish. At least a third of those species are restricted to peat swamp habitats. That means they're found in peat swamps and nowhere else. And in addition to that, the plants as well, really high numbers of plants and quite a decent number of endemics. But as an undergrad, I had the, I would say pleasure, I wouldn't say pleasure, it was a nightmare, a bit of a nightmare to work on this species. This is Pedocypris. It's the smallest vertebrate on the planet. It's only about 5 millimeters. The story goes that they had been collecting this species since the 90s, but they believed that because it was so small that it was immature of an adult fish. So no one actually looked at it until they kept on collecting it over the years, and they realized they've never seen the adult. And when they looked under the microscope, they see the reproductive organs, and they realize that this is the smallest vertebrate on the planet. So my undergrad project was to actually go to Peninsular Malaysia, collect this fish, and try to breed it. And we went to Peninsular Malaysia. I don't have pictures of that that moment. That peat swamp that we went to collect it from, one huge part of it had been removed. And as a result of it, we could no longer find the fish. What we did was we found a collector that we knew who had 12 of these fish, and we were able to bring those fish together, and we were trying to breed them. Now, this species, no one it had only been described a few years before. No one even knew much about reproductive biology. We were not able to breed it, and as a result, in a fish tank, I slowly saw one by one the fish dying until the 12th fish died, and then it was a local population extinction. And we had not seen this species in the wild for a while. Whether it's still there, I don't really know. But as a young biologist, like as an undergrad, it was like a nightmare, right? You're trying to save species from extinction. You know this thing is super rare. This might be the last of its population left, and then you see it going extinct. And then I kind of realized that when you can't actually, like some of these uncharismatic species, even though it's the smallest vertebrate on the planet, you can't really save them just by knowing much about it. You need to actually save the habitat. And if you save the habitat, you'd be able to save the species. It kind of changed my thinking. I kind of realized that the science focus alone is not enough. We need to kind of figure out a way to kind of translate that into conservation action. And the same thing applies for plants. This is a species that I described from Thailand, and I'll show it a bit later. Many. And when it comes to peat swamps, orangutan densities in peat swamps are double that of mineral soils, mainly because what we believe is that mineral soil forests flower and fruit on the tropics infrequently. But peat swamps, there's not a decent seed bank. So there's always something flowering and fruiting in the rainforest, in the tropical peatlands. So the densities are higher. So a majority of the peat, as far as I know, most of the peat of the orangutans in Southeast Asia are on peat, at least double the populations. And when it comes to peat swamp fish, this is work from Lucas Ruber. You have these beautiful colors. Most of you might have seen peat swamp. You would have seen fighting fish. Fighting fish are really, really colorful, and most of them come from these kind of black water peatland habitats. And the reason that they probably have the colors is because in black water you can't see the colors. So they're very well camouflaged in those environments. And you get these very different kinds of fish. And I'm just going to show you this one example of this fish. This is the licorice gourami. And the thing about the licorice gourami is it's licorice because of the sweet that you get in Europe and other places that looks like licorice. So it's all that. Every single dot on this map, the map created by Lucas, by the way, it represents the distribution of that species that we know of. And you can notice quickly that there's a lot of dots found in only some places and nowhere else. So what that really means is that because the peat swamp habitats are so acidic and so unique, once a species of fish adapts to a peat swamp, it can't actually move between a peat swamp habitat through a fast-flowing river to another habitat. So the endemism level is really high. There are really high levels of endemics. But what this also means is that every time a peat swamp is lost or converted, that species goes extinct. And one of those species that might have gone extinct that we're not 100% sure of is that one that I saw going extinct in a fish tank. And it's happening across the region when it comes to fish. It's not just peat, it's other habitats as well. There's many. But I after this event, I kind of never worked on fish again. And even in the other species that we get in the peat swamp fish, you also get similar patterns of hyperdiversity, and it follows the previous drainage patterns and everything. So my original belief still stood there, but the idea was that just working on fish, I am not able to actually save the habitat. That if you want to save the species, you have to save the habitat. So then that's actually when I started moving into plants and trying to save ecosystems as opposed to saving species. So I moved into the Botanic Gardens. I was a senior arborist there. I was looking after trees. I learned how to plant them, how to restore ecosystems, manage trees, and at the same time create botanical collections. But again, a lot of this, while this was happening, the deforestation in Southeast Asia was still ongoing. And in Singapore, we do a very good job in our botanic gardens, but we don't play a very regional role. And then my thought was that I needed to spend more time actually out in the field rather than just saving species ex situ. So I took a master's in plant taxonomy, and in that master's I actually reviewed, like, and as a botanist, I think it's a holy grail to actually write a flora, to actually look at every single species that you can find for a specific family or genus, and then review it and find new things. And it's interesting because it's like a detective work. You're looking through old specimens, you're going to the field, you're looking at stuff. And I did a lot of field work across the region, from eastern Indonesia all the way through Cambodia and Thailand and Sumatra. And eventually going through, the taxonomy I came up was that I found 7 new species. And again, I was just like exhilarating, right? Finding new species is like really, really amazing, and they're all over the place. I'm only going to show you some of the one of the species that I studied, but this is just a family that I worked on. It's called Memesylon. It has these really psychedelic blue flowers, these really beautiful flowers. We don't really know much about them other than the fact that these species exist. Just like I said about that one tree, that we know that it exists. Most tropical trees, that's all we know. We know that they exist. We probably know the name, or maybe most of them we don't even know the name. And they're pollinated by these amazing stingless bees. And they have this really interesting gland at the bottom on the anther. It's an oil gland that we don't really know what it does. But we have seen bees kind of collecting wax from it and all that kind of stuff. So I know it's a plant talk, so you have to bear with me with some of this plant stuff. And when it comes to the family, it's scattered across the world. It's separated between the Old World and the New World. In the New World, you get 2 genera, and then majority of them are in the Old World. And there's a lot of new species that we find. Like, this is just a paper from 2012, just mentioning that there's an existence of 51 new species in Madagascar, just based on the specimens. But now it's increased, it's double that number. But again, the taxonomist doesn't have any time to describe them. So we just know that they're new, and no one's really described them because we're kind of too busy trying to save the habitat rather than describe the species. That we've reached a point where we need to save the habitats. And well, the taxonomy will help us. The deforestation is happening too fast that we can't keep up when it comes to the taxonomy. But again, this is just some of the stuff that we know about these species. So out of the species that I've described so far, I mean, some are in review. It's been 13 years since I think 12 years since I originally did the taxonomy, but I've been focusing so much on the ground conservation work that the taxonomy has taken a back seat. So I've sat on these new species just like the person from Madagascar, and I'll get them done eventually. But I want to talk about one species that I really described, which is Memesylon maxwellii. It's from southern Thailand. So it's an interesting one because I knew it was new because I'd looked at all the species, and from this specimen that I had seen, it's really distinctive leaves. The flowers were different. It didn't look like anything I'd seen before, and it had been collected by a botanist called Maxwell. J.F. Maxwell was quite a character, and it was in southern Thailand in this one location there with limestone hills. So I went to look for it, and after like a couple of weeks and weeks of searching over a number of different field trips, we finally found this one location with 20 trees, and it was just a tiny shrub, and it had these tiny flowers which are only about 4 millimeters in size. We don't actually know what even pollinates a flower that kind of size. And then we found it, and I went to Max and I told him, oh, we found this species that you had collected. And he asked me, like, his specimen numbering system was a very weird one. He has this, normally everyone in plant collecting or animal collecting, they'll have a numbering system that continues on from when you start till you stop collecting. But he had a numbering system that started every year. So 86699 means the 699th specimen collected in 1986. And when I told him that I had gone to find this species, and it took me like weeks and weeks, and we finally found it, he asked me what the number was. And once I told him the number, and this was 27 years after he originally collected it, he thought for like 5 minutes, and he said, oh, you go up that footpath on that side, and on the left of it, probably 100 meters, there are about 10 plants there. And so he described exactly the location of where these things are. And it's quite phenomenal. What this actually means is that his numbering system was a cataloging system in his head. Without even looking at anything, he could say exactly where plants that he had collected 27 years ago, even 50 years ago exactly were, and what was about it. He could even tell me on the specimen that, oh, the specimen I collected was a flowering one or a fruiting one. Or I went back to the same specimen a few years later and I collected the fruits on it. And going a bit into detail about that, the reason I named it after him was he died in 2016, I think. So I described the species in honor of him. And then I actually started looking at all the specimens that he had collected. And he had actually collected 31 unique plant collections and 120,000 specimens. So he's probably the largest, one of the most collected people in Thailand and Indochina. I mean, 120,000 specimens, some herbaria only contain that amount of specimens. And he had described 185 new taxa as new to science. And no one will even know because he was so busy in the field just doing his work that most people wouldn't even know that he existed. And this is the thing when it comes to plant collections, a lot of them, 2% of all the plant collectors would have collected 50% of all type specimens, like the species that are described have been collected by just 2%. And a lot of this happened in the past. We're having a lot of deforestation and land use change happening now, but we're not having anywhere near as much collection or anywhere as near as much work being done. So its extinction is ongoing, even though it's just not being talked about as much as climate changes. And here is probably after another species which I described, which is Hangwana. And this is actually to lead on to that thing about the fact that we're not really describing or looking, is when this genera of plants, when you press them, everything dries black. So everyone assumed that every single specimen of Hangwana was a single species. So the first species was described, I think, 150 years ago. Ever since then, all the way for about 150 years, no one described a new species. Until in the 2000s, someone went to the field and photographed all the Hangwana that they saw, and they realized that they were all different colors and shapes and everything. And then they realized that all these things that were a single species in the herbaria were actually multiple different species. We think that there are now about 70 or 80 different species. And you can even just see from these colors that the red and the yellow and the differences in colors from the species, between the species. So we described, after many years, we described a new species of Hangwana from Bukit Timah in Singapore. Now, this shows you a footpath here. The footpath here, and just near the footpath, you get this new species. We have 400,000 people passing this species every year, of this plant every year, without realizing it's a new species. And it's only 100 meters from the entrance of the park. When we think about that in context, that Singapore has one of the highest collection densities on the planet. There's almost like 5,721. This is unpublished stuff that I've done in the past, which haven't got around publishing it. Like, we have high densities of plant specimens, a lot of botanists coming here, and yet you get new species described 100 meters from the entrance where 400,000 people pass. And if you look at the specimen density map here, which on the top right side, it's actually telling you that places like Borneo only have 35 specimens per 100 square kilometers, or Sumatra has only 22 specimens per 100 square kilometers. And so imagine if in a place like Singapore, you are describing new species like this, then imagine those places which we're not really collecting at all, or there haven't been in the past. And then in addition to, and that's why we called it Hangwana neglecta, because it was there all the time and it had been neglected. So we called it Hangwana neglecta. At the same time, just after that, I published a new species from Thailand. Again, a Peatswamp species found in only one place. I called it Hangwana thailandica. And I collaborated on another 2 species from Borneo, one from central Kalimantan and one from the island of Karimate in western Kalimantan. Again, this species on the right is a tiny species, only about that big. It's found in a valley. It's in a gorge where there's a river going, and there's tiny bits of forest in the corner, and this species is found there, and we don't know anything about it other than it exists in this one location. And that's, most of what we know about most species. In addition to the fact that I'm also sitting on about 3 other species, which I haven't had time to describe, just like the Mimicylons, one from Brunei, one from central Kalimantan, one from Peninsula. New species just waiting to be described, but it's focusing more on the saving the habitats rather than describing the species now. So going from the taxonomy, I kind of figured that, okay, I needed to kind of work on more of the research side and the policy side to try and create the science base to push for conservation. And that was probably one of the last times I met Bill in Cairns, when I was working with one of his postdocs on this carbon emissions paper for peatlands. And I did my PhD on that topic in the future. So what is a peat swamp? Peat swamps are mainly when organic matter falls into water. The organic matter, just like compost, if it's in water, it doesn't decompose. It takes a long time to decompose, and it starts accumulating. And over time, there's more organic matter than the surrounding area, and it gets raised up, and you have a wetland system which is raised and independent of hydrology, with most of the water coming from rainwater. Now, this system is maintained by the water, but if you drain it, you can actually plant crops on it, like oil palm or acacia. And the result is that as you drain the water out of the organic matter decomposes. Sometimes it's rapidly released as fire, through fire as haze, or sometimes it just sinks on its own at about 3 to 5 centimeters a year, just with background decomposition. And that's the problem in Southeast Asia that we have in the peatlands, that 21% of the lowland Southeast Asian area is peatlands, but they are sinking at a certain rate. But there are issues about it, but poverty is a huge issue that needs to be addressed as well. So, and we've seen this kind of thing happen before. So what is the peat swamp? Low nutrients, uniquely adapted plants, positive feedback between plants and peat. There's 92 gigatons of carbon. And just to put it in context, that carbon is stored in the peat. There's about 800 gigatons of total global atmospheric carbon. So we're talking about 10%, maybe higher than 10 or 15% of global atmospheric carbon, an equivalent stored in lowland peatland carbons in Southeast Asia. Eventually, many years from now, maybe probably 50 to 100 years from now, the loss of peat will lead to irreversible flooding, because the peatlands are maintained because more organic matter is going in than going out. But when you have drainage-based agriculture, there's more carbon going out than going in. So eventually, your soil will continue to sink until it's irreversibly flooded. Similar to the Netherlands is a good example. So peatland conversion, large scale, many different reasons. And this is probably one of the last times I did land use planning kind of modeling, or hoping that it might lead to land use change, was actually looking at the 2010 scenario and seeing what's going to happen, that a lot of the peatlands were, only 42% of the peatlands were protected, 28% is, but then out of the remaining peatlands, 28% is actually in concessions. And that is probably some of the best protected peatlands in Southeast Asia, actually, that concession has. Yes, they have done deforestation at the same time, but they have been responsible for protecting and managing some of the most important peatlands in Southeast Asia today. And then there's also 25% of peatlands which are not protected at all. They can be converted. So the ideal would be to protect everything that's remaining, but it's not possible for multiple different reasons. But just keeping in mind that 28% of peatlands is still within concession areas, and most of it is being protected, most of it at least in high conservation value areas. The one thing that's gone under the radar for peatlands has been the smallholder conversion. But the largest driver for conversion of peatlands has been smallholders. And we normally go after oil palm and acacia. And oil palm and acacia companies now have a lot of scrutiny from international media, from the public. But when it comes to smallholders, their conversion is still ongoing. It has been the greatest contributor, and it's still ongoing, and we don't really talk about it that much because it's also associated with poverty elevation. So in reality, deforestation rates haven't necessarily dropped significantly. They've dropped a bit, but it's still ongoing because of different challenges that are ongoing. So the next question is the deforestation happening legal? So this is also stuff that I did at the time, was to look at Indonesian law and even Malaysian law and even Bruneian law to kind of figure out whether the conversion of this forest was actually legal. And in reality, sometimes it's not, sometimes it is, but the biggest issue is about enforcement of some of these things and the underlying issues. One major difference between Indonesian law and probably Singapore law, which is what I compared it against, is that they use civil law in Indonesia versus common law. So the difference is that in common law, you have, I mean, I'm not even a lawyer trying to explain this, right? But let me try to explain it how I understand it. When it comes to common law, you have a case happening, and once a case is decided, it sets a precedent for future cases. But in civil law, it doesn't. They don't base it on previous precedents. The judge looks at it and he decides what needs to be done. He might take some inferences from previous cases, but he can completely rule in the opposite direction to a previous case that had ruled in a different way. And the problem therein lies that you get different laws and contradictions in the laws. So you might have an agriculture law saying that you need to clear land for agriculture. Then you might have a forest protection law saying that you need to protect forests. So when it comes to the court, you can actually decide. I mean, the judge has to decide which law is he going to use. So it kind of makes it difficult to kind of see some of these things happen. I never published any of this because one thing is that if I want to continue to work in Indonesia, I have to be respectful to the environment and the climate that's there. And it is eventually their laws and what they want to implement. And I didn't see the point in me publishing this review that I had done because of the fact that it might make it very difficult for me to continue to work there. And on top of that, it will also make it difficult for other people to kind of work there as well. So I never did. So I've been very sensitive in the way that I've kind of gone through with some of this stuff. But I've used it in different ways, and most of it has been in the background, on the ground, meeting people, meeting NGOs, meeting government, trying to get stuff moving in the right direction. And one of these contradictions in the law is, of course, about this law about preventing and combating forest destruction. That it says that as long as it's not done in an organized group, then it's okay. and it allows people in groups of 2 people or less to perform logging for local uses. And it says not for commercial purposes, and none of this is really defined. So there's ways to get around a lot of this. So there are loopholes in some of these laws as well. But the background, in the same time that this deforestation is going, the important fact is to also maintain that between 1999 and 2020, Indonesia actually reduced their poverty level from 20% to 9.4%. And it actually moved up to becoming an upper middle income country. But when you talk about poverty, a good example is in the province of Jambi, the poverty line is only about $200 a month. So it's still quite low. And then when you still consider that there's 26 million people still below the poverty line, below the $200 a month income, it's kind of serious issues. So some of this deforestation, particularly the smallholder-driven deforestation, has actually led to improvement in livelihoods and poverty alleviation at the same time. It might not have been the most ideal way, but it did happen, and there were benefits to it at the same time. So in my view, when it comes to conservation practice, I've kind of looked at it in the form that you need to have legislation that allows you to kind of enable conservation to happen. You need the land use planning to actually allow legislation to be implemented. Like particularly when it comes to peatlands, you can't conserve part of a peatland or a wetland. You need to conserve the entire hydrological area of the wetland. You can't, because water unites the wetland. You drain part of it, it'll drain the part that you're trying to conserve. So you can't conserve part of it. You need to conserve the whole. And then when it comes to all of this, you need finance and livelihoods, because communities and poverty alleviation is a key aspect of conservation outcomes. And you need land use tenure, enforcement, and alternative agriculture and silviculture techniques to actually allow it. Like when it comes to oil palm, there are serious issues about it. And a lot of people have written a lot of things about it. But at the same time, we don't have a viable economic alternative yet, one that will provide an economic income. I mean, agroforestry is another thing, but it's still, I would say that in most of these areas that are currently under oil palm, it's the first time that they've ever transitioned from forest to any kind of agriculture or any other land use. And the effects are going to come when climate change affects some of this production, whether it's oil palm or peat, both of them. And we haven't really thought about the alternatives. And when it comes to this, protected areas, in my view, at least on the ground, I feel that they have good legislation, they have good land use tenure because they have boundaries, but enforcement, alternative incomes, and land use planning sometimes to kind of enable forests to be protected, it doesn't actually exist. And finance and livelihoods in particular to fund protected area management is still very low. And agreeably so in some of these countries where poverty, they have to choose with the pot of money, what are they going to do? Are they going to try and improve livelihoods, or are they going to try and improve protected area management? And most of the time, livelihoods takes precedent over it. So we've never actually figured out how to pay for conservation. And I mean, we see that in Southeast Asia across the board. And a good example is this place where I ended up doing my PhD, which was Birdlife National Park, where the national park itself is having serious issues about protection, and it's burning and encroachment and many things happening. That it is Indonesia's first national park, but it is also one of the ones that's under the most amount of threat. And it's only part of the national park that's actually protected. And then the next is, of course, a privately owned, not privately owned, it's government, but it was pushed by Sinarmas, the APP group, to actually get a protected area designated there. They had 2 or 3 concessions in the forest. And after the biodiversity assessments, they pushed the government to protect the area as a man and biosphere reserve, and not develop their concessions in the area as a result of it. And this is a private company pushing for this rather than a outside NGO or a government pushing for this. Like, you do have this kind of private sector initiatives also that really do work at the same time. It's an interesting one overall. It's like they have also participated in some of the largest deforestation events, but at the same time, if they didn't push for this biodiversity area to be protected, this forest wouldn't be there today. It was designated for conversion, and they pushed for saving it. Government played a big role in it as well, but companies did as well. Another one is, of course, the Riau Ecosystem Restoration Concession, which Jeff does quite a bit of work on as well. That originally, when they wanted to build a road through the Kampar, in the 2000s, that was when I was actually, really actively fighting against this kind of thing, saying that no, this is just a land grab. And this idea to put plantations around it was mainly a land grab for the main forest. But the reason this forest exists today is because of the plantation ring around the Kampar Peninsula. And I've been in meetings in Jakarta where indigenous, or not indigenous, local communities have been there along with the April management, and they, along with the government, and the local communities are screaming at the concession holder saying, you're not allowing us to cut our forests. We want wood. And what they're saying is we're just enforcing the law. And in reality, that is what needs to be done. And you do need to figure out this kind of thing about, we need the legislation, finance, livelihood, everything together to kind of match up to allow the forest to happen. Probably one of the last bit on taxonomy that I'm doing today is actually a follow-on from my PhD, which is a peatland restoration project. And in that, what I focused on was actually the fact that we need to restore peatlands, but no one knows how to identify them. No one is going to go to herbarium specimens, and there are very few people who can identify species. So we went out to the field and we started photographing every single tree species we could find. Out of 300 in Southeast Asia, we have about 210 photographs. And while we were in the field, we were very lucky to be there during a mass flowering and fruiting season. And a lot of this happened during COVID, and we got a lot of things in flower. We found 7 new species on the site from my PhD onwards, but we've only got 2 of them in flower and fruit. The first one on the left is Disepalum rava gambut. Disepal means it's a kind of structure on the flower, which means 2. Sepal means 2 sepals. And it has this really amazing red-colored inflorescences, or not actually inflorescences, but it's a compound fruit flower, or compound inflorescence of some sorts. And then this other thing is Lophopetalum, which actually means crown flower. And it's also because of these kind of tiny crown petals, because of these petals having these crowns on it. Tanagambut, both of them, I kind of tend to name my species based on the local language. So in Thailand, I named one Memesilon Kimau, which actually means drunken Memesilon, because people had collected it for a long time, but no one had known it was a new species. So I put it as a drunken Memesilon. There's a bit of debate on whether I should use a name or not. And in these names, it's Rava Gambut and Tanagambut, which means Peatswamp and peatland. Getting these species published was really interesting because I knew it was new from 2017, but we had never seen it in flower and fruit. And we had to get a tree climber to climb up the tree once every 3 months for 2 years before we got it in fruit. And once we got it in fruit, we realized that actually you need it in flower to describe it. So we had to continue for another year before we could actually describe it as new. And now, of course, other trees, other ways of climbing them. And this forest is full of tigers as well. And every time you're doing field work, you'd always get tiger footprints and tiger scat in the plots or just around us. And most of it was really fresh. And we'd often have to swim across the rivers to kind of get to the fields, some of the trees in the field site, because it was a really rare tree even in that site. Like, we just know that a few trees exist and that's it. Swim across the river. Hopefully there's no tigers. And it has these amazing stilt roots, just like mangroves, but it's in a freshwater swamp. And it's a huge tree. It's about, I think it was about 40 meters, 30 to 40 meters tall. A massive, massive tree that had never been described. And again, the other species, Disepalum again. And this is Randy Agusti, who is from Borneo, and he's the main botanist that I'm kind of. So my main role in Indonesia when it comes to peatland work, and most of the work, is to actually develop Indonesian botanists and Indonesian capacity. So I can to push them forward to take the lead in everything, and I sit in the background and do what I can. And this is a Peatswamp durian, and if you've ever been to Southeast Asia, you might have heard about this fruit or even tried this. And in the Peatswamps, you get this really, really interesting one with a red aril inside. This is a smaller one, but you get a bit of a bigger one as well. And you get even Peatswamp rambutans and Peatswamp mangosteens as well. I think mangosteens, yes, and lychees, yeah. So you get a lot of amazing things. And again, we were very lucky to be there in a flowering and fruiting season in the Peatswamps. And it flowers. I mean, I've been working in Peatswamps since 2005. And I'd never been there when there was a flowering and fruiting. And I wasn't lucky enough because this was COVID. So Randy was the one who was there. And everything in the forest was in flower and fruit. The smells, the colors, and everything. And a lot of these species that we saw, we photographed, we collected, had never been photographed alive or even seen, not alive, I mean, seen in flower or fruit. So we went there during the flowering. We happened to be there during flowering and fruiting. Everything was there. And then we collected everything, photographed everything to make this field guide. And at the same time, we made all the specimens, and we actually collected, I think, 15 species, not 15, 70 species, we got them into the nursery and had about 10,000 individuals for restoration, planning and all that kind of stuff. So we did quite a bit of work at that time, and that our funding has kind of run out right now, but we're still doing this free of charge. So just like I said, when it comes to taxonomy, there's not much money in it. So we have to do other jobs to kind of make the income to be able to pay for the taxonomic work that needs to happen to save these species. And again, when I posted this last year, I didn't expect it to go like kind of viral in a sense, but I just only wrote what I thought, which is the fact that we had found this tree and we had been following it for years. And all we know about it is that it exists and now it has a name. That's it. And if that forest goes, everything we know about that species goes with it. And we were very lucky that we have really good journalists in Southeast Asia. One of them wrote about it, and it got up in the Straits Times, and from there it went everywhere. It was a BBC, one of the 22 BBC species, and then the other ones as well. A lot of media attention came about just because of that single LinkedIn post. And that is it. That's what I have. If I kind of taken it as more an anecdotal how I describe species at different points in my career and my thinking at the time, and also the fact that I still believe in taxonomy, that I just have to find a way to pay for it. Over to you, Bibi.
Thank you.